The air was heavy with the scent of freshly brewed coffee as Charles sat in his favorite armchair, the worn leather creaking beneath him. It was one of those rare mornings where the house was still. Outside, the sun had just begun to break through the morning mist, casting long shadows across the porch where Sarah, his late wife, used to sit with him, sipping her tea and chatting about the day ahead. Now it was just him, alone with the memories that clung to every corner of their home. Charles had always prided himself on being a good provider. For decades, he had put in long hours, first as a carpenter and later as a construction manager, dedicating himself to the work that would secure a future for his family. He'd raised Adam and Megan with the belief that family was the most important thing in the world. They had everything they needed: good food on the table, a roof over their heads, and love unconditionally. At least, that's what he thought. But that morning, as he sat there in the quiet of his living room, everything began to unravel. It was around 10 a.m. when the phone rang. Charles glanced at the caller ID and saw Adam's name flashing on the screen. He smiled softly, brushing his hand through his thinning hair. "Hey, son," he greeted, picking up the receiver. "Hi, Dad. How's it going?" Adam's voice came through, warm but distant. "Oh, Charles replied, settling back in his chair. Same old, same old. Just enjoying my coffee. How's work?" "Busy," Adam said. "You know, the usual. But hey, listen, I wanted to talk to you about something." Charles' heart tightened, sensing the shift in his son's tone. They didn't speak much these days, not like they used to. There was always something between them, an invisible wall that had been quietly built over the years. He hadn't been able to pinpoint it, but he knew something was off. "Sure, what's on your mind?" There was a long pause before Adam spoke again. "Dad, I've been talking to Megan and we've been thinking about you." The weight of those words made Charles's chest tighten. About me? He could already feel the familiar sting of unease creeping up his spine. "We've been really worried about you," Adam continued, his voice softer now. "You're getting older, and I know you're trying to take care of everything yourself, but we think it's time you had some help." Charles frowned, confused. "Help? I'm fine, Adam. I've been fine for years." I know, Adam rushed to say, "but you're not getting any younger. And Megan and I have talked about it, and we think it might be time to look into getting you into a facility. A good one, of course, somewhere you'd be comfortable." A cold chill spread through Charles, and for a moment he thought he might have misheard. "A facility?" he repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "You mean a nursing home?" There was a slight hesitation on the other end of the line. "Yeah, something like that." Charles set his coffee down on the table, his hands trembling slightly. A nursing home? He had imagined the day would come when he would need help. But never had he imagined that the decision would come so quickly, and worse, that it would come from his own son. The very person he had worked his whole life for. The person he had raised to understand the importance of family, of loyalty. "I don't need a nursing home," Charles said, his voice steady but strained. "I can take care of myself." Adam's voice shifted then, and Charles caught the faintest trace of frustration. "Dad, it's not about that. It's about what's best for everyone, for you too. We've talked to some places, and the sooner we do it, the better. You know how much work it is to manage everything on your own." Charles closed his eyes, the words cutting deeper than he'd like to admit. It wasn't the first time Adam had expressed concern about him getting older, but it was the first time that it had come with a suggestion so final, so cold. His thoughts spiraled, racing back to all the sacrifices he had made, working long hours, coming home tired and worn, but always with a smile for his family. He had built this home with his hands, with Sarah by his side, and the idea of leaving it, of being forced out, felt like a betrayal, not just to him, but to everything he had worked for. "And what about the house?" Charles asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was another pause, this one longer, more uncomfortable. When Adam finally spoke again, his tone was matter-of-fact. "Well, we were thinking that we could sell it. The market's really good right now, and if we sell it, we can afford to put you somewhere nice. A place that can take care of you properly. And with the way things are going, we could probably get a pretty good price for it." Charles felt his heart sink. The house, his house, was no longer just a home. It was an asset, a way to pay for what they saw as his future. A future that didn't include him living on his own terms, but rather being tucked away in some sterile institution where he would fade into the background. His hands tightened into fists, the anger starting to well up inside him. He glanced at the photograph of Sarah on the mantel, her smiling face frozen in time. She had always been the rock, the heart of this home. And now he was being told that the very place they had built together, where they had raised their child, where they had spent holidays, anniversaries, and simple, ordinary days, was to be sold, to make way for the convenience of a nursing home. "Adam," Charles said, his voice firm, "I'm not going anywhere, not to a nursing home, and not away from this house." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Adam spoke again, his voice was softer, almost apologetic. "Dad, I don't want to hurt you. But you have to understand, this is for your own good. We're just trying to help." Charles felt a lump form in his throat, but he held it together. "I don't need help like that," he said quietly. "What I need is for you to understand that I'm still capable. I'm still your father, Adam. I'm not some burden to be tossed aside." The line was silent for a moment, and then Adam let out a sigh. "Okay, Dad. We'll talk more when I get back. But you need to think about it. You need to think about what's best for everyone." Charles didn't respond. He just let the silence stretch between them, thick with unspoken words. After the call ended, he sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from him where Sarah used to sit. Her absence was a physical ache, a constant reminder of how alone he now felt in his own home. And as he sat there, one thought echoed louder than the others. I had worked my entire life for this house, for my family, and now my son was treating me like I was just another asset to be sold. Charles took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of something he couldn't quite explain. The feeling that everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was slipping through his fingers. But in that moment, something else began to stir inside him. "I'm not done yet." The afternoon passed in a haze for Charles. He tried to shake off the cold sting of the conversation with Adam, but it lingered like an unwelcome shadow. He busied himself with little tasks around the house, checking the mail, watering the plants Sarah had lovingly cared for, and even making himself a sandwich. But nothing seemed to distract him. Each movement, each task felt mechanical, like he was simply going through the motions of a life he no longer recognized. As the clock ticked closer to evening, Charles found himself standing in front of the mantel, staring at the framed family photos. The picture of Sarah and him, laughing on their wedding day, was front and center. Beside it was the one of Adam as a boy, his smile bright and innocent that looked like it was taken only yesterday. Charles's fingers traced the frame, his gaze lingering on his son's youthful face, before his eyes moved to the more recent photos. Adam at his wedding, at family gatherings, the joyful celebrations of birthdays and holidays. But now, all he could see was what had been said, what had been planned behind his back. He thought about the years he'd spent working to give his family a better life, about the sacrifices he and Sarah had made to build a future, and how, in one cruel conversation, everything he thought he knew about his family had been flipped on its head. How could Adam, his son, his flesh and blood, speak so coldly, so calculating about him? How had everything changed so suddenly? As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, the phone rang again. Charles almost didn't answer, but then he saw the familiar name on the caller ID, Adam. A strange lump formed in his throat, and for a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail. But then, as if by instinct, his hand reached for the receiver and he brought it to his ear. "Hello, Dad?" Adam's voice came through, light, almost too light, like he was trying to sound normal, to hide something. "How are you holding up?" Charles paused, taking in the words. The warmth in Adam's voice was a facade. He could feel it in his bones. It wasn't the usual casual check-in. It wasn't the voice of a son who genuinely cared. No, this was the voice of someone who was trying to smooth over something uncomfortable, something that shouldn't have been said in the first place. "I'm fine, Adam," Charles replied, forcing the words out. Just been thinking." There was a slight hesitation on the other end of the line. "About what?" "Oh, just about everything, I guess." Charles sighed, sitting back down in his armchair. His eyes drifted back to the photo of Sarah and him, and suddenly the weight of the house, the weight of everything he had worked for, felt unbearable. The house, the family, how everything's changed." Adam cleared his throat, his voice faltering for just a moment. "Yeah, I know things have been different lately, but hey, we'll figure it out, right? Maybe we can get together this weekend when I get back, talk things through." Charles' grip on the phone tightened. Talk things through? Adam's words didn't sound reassuring. They sounded rehearsed, like a man trying to buy time. Charles had a feeling deep down that this conversation, like the last one, was going to be about something much more than just family. It was going to be about control. "That sounds nice, son," Charles said, his voice steady, "but I'm not so sure we have much left to talk about. Not after what I overheard earlier." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Charles thought Adam had hung up. Then, in a soft, almost pleading voice, Adam spoke. "Dad, I don't know what you heard, but you have to understand, Megan and I were just trying to think ahead. You're getting older. We're just trying to make sure everything's taken care of. We don't want you to worry." Charles's stomach churned. The words sounded so hollow, so distant from the loving son he had raised. "We don't want you to worry." That was the excuse? Charles had spent his life making sure his family had what they needed. And now Adam was telling him he needed to worry about himself? "I heard everything, Adam," Charles said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I heard you and Megan talk about putting me in a nursing home, about selling the house." Adam's response was swift, defensive. "Dad, it's not like that. We were just trying to make sure you're in a good place. Somewhere safe, where you'll be looked after. The house, it's just too much for you to handle on your own now." Charles leaned forward, his hands shaking. You think I can't handle my own life anymore? You think I'm too old to make decisions for myself? Adam's voice softened, but the coldness still lingered. Dad, please don't take this the wrong way. We're not trying to push you out or anything, but we need to be realistic. I need to know you're going to be okay, and right now, it just feels like everything is slipping away. Slipping away? Charles repeated, his voice rising. Slipping away? What's slipping away, Adam? My independence? My dignity? My home? You're talking about me like I'm some kind of burden, something to be discarded when it gets inconvenient. I gave everything for you, for this family. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Charles felt the weight of the silence press against him, heavy and suffocating. Adam had no response, at least none that Charles was willing to hear. He could imagine Adam's face on the other end, confused, maybe even a little guilty, but not truly remorseful. Dad, please, Adam began again, his voice quieter this time, almost like he was trying to pacify a child. I know this is hard, but we're just trying to do what's best for you, for all of us. Charles felt a wave of cold rage wash over him, and in that moment, he realized the truth. Adam hadn't been trying to look out for him. He had been planning his own future without even considering the man who had given him everything. He was no longer the son Charles had raised. He was a stranger, someone who saw his father as a problem to solve, a financial burden to be disposed of. I don't need your help, Charles said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. What I need, Adam, is for you to understand that I'm not a burden. Not yet. Not ever. There was no response, only silence. And then the faint click of the line going dead. Charles sat there for what felt like an eternity, his hands gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't feel like a father anymore. He felt like a fool. He set the phone down and stood up, walking slowly toward the mantel once more. The photos of his family, his wife, his son, his daughter-in-law, stared back at him, frozen in time. Memories that seemed so distant now, so far away from the reality of what was happening. In that moment, something inside Charles shifted. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever felt before. But there was no time for tears, no time for self-pity. He wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let them take everything from him. He took one last look at the house, at the life he had built, and he made a decision. He wasn't going to be their burden. He wasn't going to fade away quietly into the background of their lives. If they thought they could strip him of his home and his dignity, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The time had come for him to take control of his own future. And it was going to start right here, right now. The house was silent that night, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Charles sat in the dim light of the living room, his eyes fixed on the photo of Sarah that still rested on the mantel, her warm smile a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating reality that surrounded him. The house, their house, felt different now. It had been his and Sarah's sanctuary, a place filled with laughter, love, and memories of raising Adam. But tonight, it felt like a prison. He could still hear Adam's voice in his head, the cold, calculating words that had shattered the illusion he had been clinging to. We need to think about what's best for you, for everyone. Everyone except for him, Charles thought bitterly. He wasn't a child to be managed. He wasn't some burden to be discarded. The betrayal had cut deep, and the pain was raw. But as he sat there in the dark, staring at the shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. Something inside him shifted. A quiet resolve began to form, growing stronger with each passing minute. He was done being passive, done being a pawn in Adam's plan. He wasn't going to be their burden, not now, not ever. Charles stood up, his legs feeling stiff from sitting for so long. The house felt colder now, as if the very walls had sensed his resolve. He walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains just enough to peer out into the quiet street. The neighborhood was still. The homes across the street stood as they always had, bathed in the soft light of street lamps. It was peaceful, serene. But he knew that peace was fleeting. It would be replaced by something else entirely, something that would bring him the freedom he deserved. He moved slowly to the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. His hand found the old wooden drawer where Sarah used to keep the bills, the receipts, the papers that had once been so important. He opened it and ran his fingers over the crinkled papers, some yellowed with age, others faded from use. He had always hated the paperwork, the constant need to balance accounts, to keep track of every penny. But it was something Sarah had insisted on. She was meticulous, organized, something he had always admired about her. The thought of her, her voice, her presence, her love, was what kept him going. It was for her and for everything they had built together that he was doing this now. Charles pulled out the stack of papers and set them on the kitchen table. His hands shook as he flipped through the financial records, tracing the numbers with his finger. The mortgage, the insurance, the property taxes, all the details of a life that had been hard-earned. He thought about the years of sacrifice, the long hours he had worked, the overtime he had taken on to make sure Adam had every opportunity, to make sure his family was cared for. And now, his own flesh and blood wanted to take it all away. He reached for the folder labeled House Documents, the one he hadn't opened in years. Inside was the original deed to the property, the papers that proved it was his and Sarah's. He ran his thumb over the edges of the yellowing paper, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't made this house just a place to live. He had made it a home. Every nail, every floorboard, every beam. They had done it together. Every decision, from the kitchen counters to the living room furniture, had been made with love. And now Adam and Megan wanted to sell it. Charles took a deep breath, trying to steady his mind. He could feel the weight of the decision ahead of him. He wasn't going to let them take this from him, not without a fight. He sat down at the table, pulling out a notepad and a pen. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock were the only sounds that filled the room as he began to write. The plan was simple, at least for now. The house was worth nearly $1 million, and he knew that in the current market he could get a great price for it. He had never considered selling before, but now it seemed like the only option. He would sell the house, take the proceeds, and move somewhere far away, somewhere peaceful, somewhere that Adam and Megan couldn't reach him. He'd find a quiet little cottage, maybe in the mountains or by the lake, a place where he could breathe again, away from the manipulative grasp of his son. It was time for a fresh start. As he wrote down the steps, Charles's mind raced with possibilities. The money would be enough to live comfortably. He could finally enjoy the peace he had earned. He wouldn't need to rely on anyone, least of all Adam. He was still capable, still strong. His hands had built this house. His hands could build a new life. But it wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about money. It was about regaining control, about proving to himself and to Adam that he wasn't a man to be discarded. He had given everything to his family, and it was time to take something for himself. Charles knew this decision wasn't going to be easy. He knew that once the house was sold, there would be no going back. But he was ready. He was ready to leave behind the life that had been planned for him and to take control of his own future. As he looked at the notepad, he felt something shift within him. It wasn't just the decision to sell the house. It was the decision to stop being a passive bystander in his own life. No more living in the shadows of others' expectations. No more accepting what he was told to accept. He was going to live on his own terms. Charles pushed the notepad aside and stood up, stretching his back as he walked to the window once more. The moon was high in the sky now, its light casting a soft glow on the yard where he had spent so many evenings with Sarah, the garden they had planted together, the porch where they had watched the seasons change. It was all still there, still waiting, but it wasn't home anymore. It wasn't home if it didn't have the peace he needed. "I'm not finished yet," he whispered to himself, his voice steady. "I'm not finished." He took one final look around the house. The rooms that had once been filled with laughter, with love, with life. Now they felt empty. The silence was suffocating, but Charles didn't feel afraid. He felt empowered. The house was just the beginning. Tomorrow, he would call the real estate agent. He would set the plan into motion. Adam and Megan would never see this coming. They thought he was weak. They thought they could control him. But they were wrong. Charles had made his decision, and now he was going to reclaim his dignity. Charles woke early the next morning, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the kitchen window and catching the edges of the dust that had settled overnight. The house felt even emptier in the daylight, the once comforting walls now seeming cold and unwelcoming. Sarah's absence was like a gaping hole in the center of everything he had known. It was a constant ache, a reminder of what was lost, and in a strange way, what he was about to lose again. He had spent the night turning over the events of the day before in his mind, the conversation with Adam replaying over and over. But now there was no time for reflection. The plan was set in motion. Today, he would begin preparing the house for sale. He had already contacted Jill, the real estate agent he'd chosen, and arranged for a preliminary evaluation. It was time to take the first step towards a new life, and he knew that once he started, there would be no turning back. Charles made himself a cup of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding him as he sat down at the kitchen table. He stared at the stack of papers he had pulled from the drawer the night before, the old receipts, letters, and financial documents. These were the things that had once held the weight of their life together, the evidence of the sacrifices he and Sarah had made to build something meaningful, something solid for their family. And now, as he sat there, those same papers seemed like ghosts, reminders of the hard road they had traveled. Slowly, he began to sift through the documents. First came the pile of receipts for home improvement projects, the kitchen cabinet Sarah had picked out, the floors that had been installed with their own hands. He could remember every moment of it. They had worked tirelessly on this house, often late into the night after long shifts at their day jobs. Every nail driven into the walls had been a promise to each other, a promise to create a home, a future for Adam. The walls they built had been filled with hope, with the belief that they were doing something important, something lasting. Next came the utility bills, old tax records, and the statements for the second mortgage they had taken out to help pay for Adam's college tuition. Charles paused for a moment, his finger tracing the numbers. They had scrimped and saved for years to put Adam through school, working double shifts and sacrificing their own comforts so that their son could have a better future. Sarah had often said that they were doing it all for him, for his education, for his chance at a life that was free from the struggle they had known. But now, as Charles looked at those receipts, a deep, quiet anger began to grow within him. For what? For what had all of this been worth? He had worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and for what? So that Adam could turn around and treat him like an inconvenience? A burden? Charles's hand shook as he pushed aside the old bills and reached for the stack of letters in the back of the drawer. These weren't just any letters. They were from banks, insurance companies, and investment firms, all confirming the financial decisions he and Sarah had made to secure their future. As he flipped through the letters, he remembered the long nights spent at the kitchen table, reviewing their finances with Sarah, deciding where to cut corners, how to save for retirement, how to ensure that Adam would have the chance to go to college without the crushing weight of debt. Every letter, every financial plan was a testament to their determination, their love for their son. But now he saw something else in those letters, something that cut even deeper. The sacrifices they had made, the years of hard work, had been for a future that no longer existed. The very son they had fought for, the one they had poured their time and energy into, was now planning to sell their home and put him away, as if he was nothing more than a burden. Charles slammed the stack of papers down onto the table, his pulse racing. The quiet rage that had been simmering inside him for days now bubbled to the surface. He could feel the heat in his chest, the familiar fire of injustice burning through him. He had given everything for his family. Everything, and this was how he was repaid. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he walked to the window. The garden outside, once a shared project between him and Sarah, was now just another piece of the past. He could see the rose bushes they had planted together, the ones Sarah had taken such pride in, now starting to bloom again, just as they always did in the spring. The irony hit him hard. The flowers bloomed, the seasons turned, and yet here he was, preparing to sell everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, to leave behind a life he had spent decades building. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. What had gone wrong? He remembered Adam as a child, eager to learn, full of potential, always asking questions. He had watched his son grow, work hard, go to college, and start his own career. It had all seemed so perfect. He had always believed that Adam would one day take care of him the way he had cared for him, that they would continue to share this home, these memories, together. But now it seemed that all Adam saw was an opportunity to take what was his and discard the rest. Charles knew that his son had always been ambitious, driven in ways that Charles had never been. He had always pushed Adam to be better, to aim higher, to work harder. But now, looking at the stack of papers in front of him, he realized that all of that ambition had come at a price. Adam had never learned the true value of what they had built. He had never understood the sacrifices, the small moment of joy that came from hard work and sacrifice. To Adam, it had always been about getting ahead, climbing the ladder, no matter who he had to step on to get there. As Charles stood at the window, staring out at the garden, His mind began to form a plan. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could take control. He could sell the house, take the money, and live the life he had always wanted, a life that was free of the manipulation and greed that had seeped into his family. He had given Adam everything he had. Now it was time for him to take something for himself. He turned back to the kitchen table, the letters and receipts scattered in front of him like fragments of a broken dream. But Charles wasn't broken, not anymore. He would sell the house. He would leave. He would reclaim his life, his dignity, and his peace. And Adam? Adam would learn that the man he thought he could control was not so easily defeated. The morning sunlight was gentle, filtering through the blinds as Charles sat at the small kitchen table, the scattered papers from last night still strewn across its surface. His hands were steady now, the quiet rage that had burned through him the previous evening simmering into a cold, determined resolve. He had already made up his mind. He would sell the house, and he would do it on his own terms. But now there was another question that needed to be answered. What would happen when Adam and Megan found out? Charles knew he needed to take a step that would protect himself. Selling the house was one thing, but he needed to be sure that his assets, the things he had worked so hard to build, were safe. He needed to understand his rights, and for that, he would need legal help. He had done some research, asking around at the local coffee shop and speaking to a few neighbors, and had come across a well-regarded attorney named Mark who specialized in real estate and elder law. From what Charles had gathered, Mark was known for being thorough, professional, and trustworthy, qualities that made him the right person for the job. With a deep breath, Charles picked up his phone and dialed the number Mark's office had provided. His fingers trembled slightly, but he steadied himself, feeling that the weight of this decision was finally beginning to lift. Fisher and Associates, how can I help you? A pleasant voice answered on the other end. Hi, my name is Charles Hayes. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Mark Fisher. I need to discuss some legal matters regarding my property. Of course, Mr. Hayes, the receptionist replied. Mr. Fisher has an opening this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Would that work for you? That'll be fine, Charles said, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. At least he was taking the first real step. I'll be there. The drive to the law office was short, but it felt like a small journey in itself. As Charles navigated through the streets of his neighborhood, memories flooded his mind. He passed the school where Adam had once played baseball, the park where Sarah had taught him how to ride a bike, and the church where they had all attended every Sunday, back when life had been simpler, before the cracks in his family had started to show. The familiar sights felt different now. The house, the street, the life he had built, all of it now felt like something he was losing. But he wasn't just losing it, he was fighting for it. When Charles arrived at Fisher and Associates, he was greeted by a receptionist who ushered him into a small waiting area. The law office was quiet and clean, the walls lined with bookshelves and framed certificates. After a few minutes, the door opened and a tall man with graying hair and a kind expression stepped into the room. Mr. Hayes, the man asked, extending his hand. Mark Fisher, Charles replied, shaking the attorney's hand firmly. Nice to meet you. Likewise, Mark said, motioning for Charles to follow him into his office. The room was comfortable, with dark wood furniture and a large window overlooking the street. Mark gestured to the chair across from his desk and sat down behind it. What can I do for you, Mr. Hayes? Charles sat, his hands resting in his lap, his mind racing with everything he needed to say. The weight of his decision still sat heavily on his chest, but now there was something else in its place: clarity. He had made up his mind. He just needed to know he was doing the right thing. "I'm looking to sell my home," Charles began, "and I need some advice on how to protect myself and my assets. My son Adam and his wife Megan have been pressuring me to move into a nursing home, and they've already started making plans for the house. I need to know what my options are." Mark's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he listened. "I'm sorry to hear about the situation with your son," he said after a pause. "It sounds like a difficult position, but I can assure you that you have the legal right to make decisions about your property, and your assets are yours to protect." Charles nodded, but there was still uncertainty in his voice. "But my son, he thinks he's entitled to the house. He's already talking about selling it, about putting me in a nursing home so he and Megan can move forward with their plans. I don't know if I can trust him anymore." Mark raised an eyebrow, his tone firm but compassionate. "You don't have to trust him, Mr. Hayes. Legally speaking, your son has no claim to your property or your money unless you voluntarily transfer it to him or make some kind of legal arrangement that gives him that right. Even if he were to pressure you, you have the final say on what happens to your assets." Charles let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was a small but significant moment. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of relief. "So I can sell the house and keep the money?" "Absolutely," Mark replied. "You have full ownership of the property. As long as the house is titled in your name and you haven't signed any agreements giving others ownership or rights to it, it's yours to do with as you please. Adam and Megan can't legally force you to sell or move unless you agree to it. They can't sell the house out from under you." Charles leaned forward, his heart beating a little faster. "And if I wanted to move, to sell it, and move somewhere else, would there be anything stopping me from doing that?" Mark shook his head. "Nothing at all. As long as you're of sound mind and haven't been declared incompetent, you have the full right to make decisions about your living situation. In fact, it might be a good idea to have some legal documentation in place just to ensure that no one can challenge your decisions later. I'd recommend updating your will and possibly looking into some protections for your assets, especially if you think Adam and Megan might try to take further action." Charles nodded, feeling a sense of control he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since this whole ordeal had started, he felt like he was back on solid ground. "Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. I've been so caught up in everything, I wasn't sure what my rights were." Mark smiled kindly. "That's what I'm here for, Mr. Hayes. You've worked hard for what you have. You deserve to make decisions that are in your best interest." They spent the next half hour discussing the logistics of selling the house and how Charles could protect his assets going forward. Mark provided him with a few options for securing his future, including setting up a trust and revisiting his estate planning to ensure that Adam and Megan could not interfere with his choices. Charles left the meeting feeling more confident, knowing he had the legal right to protect what was his. As he walked out of Fisher and Associates, the weight on his shoulders had lightened, if only slightly. He still had a long road ahead, but at least now he had a clear direction. He was going to sell the house, and he was going to do it without Adam's interference. And when his son came knocking, thinking he could push him around, he would be ready. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt like the man he used to be, the man who could make his own decisions, who could take control of his life, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The next morning, Charles sat at the kitchen table with his cup of coffee, the steam rising in lazy spirals. The sun had barely risen, but his mind was already racing with thoughts of the next steps. He had made his decision, and now it was time to take action. He had contacted Mark, and now it was time to contact Jill. Charles had found her name in the local paper. Jill Stevens was a well-known real estate agent in the area, specializing in high-value properties. He had heard good things about her, how professional, efficient, and knowledgeable she was. She had a reputation for closing deals quickly, especially in the luxury market, and that's exactly what he needed. Time was of the essence, and Charles was done waiting. He dialed her number and waited for the ring. His hands were steady now, no longer shaking with the uncertainty that had plagued him before. The past few days had been filled with difficult decisions, but now they were beginning to feel more like a release. With every passing moment, he was taking back control of his life. "Hello, this is Jill Stevens," came the cheerful voice on the other end of the line. "Hi, Jill. This is Charles Hayes. I'm looking to sell my house and was hoping to arrange a property evaluation. I've heard you specialize in homes like mine, and I'd like to get a sense of what it's worth." "Of course, Mr. Hayes," Jill responded warmly. "I'd be happy to help you. I specialize in high-value properties in the area, and from what I've heard, your home is exactly the type of place I like to work with. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you to schedule the evaluation?" Charles nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Tomorrow's perfect. Thank you, Jill. I appreciate your help." "It's my pleasure," she said. "I'll be there around 2 p.m. tomorrow. I look forward to meeting you and seeing the house." Charles hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his cup. He felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had taken the first real step toward freeing himself from the suffocating weight of his son's expectations. Selling the house wasn't just about moving on from Adam and Megan's manipulation. It was about starting a new chapter, a chapter where he could finally breathe and live life on his own terms. The next afternoon, at exactly 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. Charles had already prepared himself for the visit, ensuring the house was neat and presentable. He had always prided himself on keeping it clean, but today, as Jill stepped over the threshold, he noticed something different. For the first time, he was seeing the house through the eyes of someone else, through the eyes of someone who didn't know its history, its secrets, its soul. Jill greeted him with a firm handshake and a warm smile. She was a woman in her early 40s, confident and poised, dressed in a professional suit with a notepad tucked under her arm. Charles led her into the living room, where she immediately began taking in the space. "Well, this is a lovely home, Mr. Hayes," she said, her eyes scanning the large open room. "I can tell that a lot of care has been put into this place." Charles nodded, his chest tightening as her words hit him. A lot of care. He could almost hear Sarah's voice, echoing through the walls, laughing and chatting about the renovations they'd made together. They had chosen every detail with love. The hardwood floors were hand-installed, the kitchen counters designed after Sarah had seen a picture in a magazine. Every wall had been painted, every room curated with the hope of building a warm, welcoming space for their family. Jill moved through the rooms, her eyes evaluating every feature. Charles followed her, trying to ignore the tightness in his throat. As they walked into the dining room, his gaze fell on the china cabinet Sarah had insisted on, its delicate contents glinting in the soft light from the chandelier. He could almost hear her laughter as they had entertained friends and family here, the clinking of glasses, the stories shared over the dinner table. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Jill stepped into the kitchen, her eyes widening as she examined the custom cabinets and granite countertops. "These are beautiful," she commented, running her hand along the edge of the countertop. "You've done some real work here. This is top-notch craftsmanship." Charles smiled faintly, the weight of nostalgia pressing on his chest. He had spent countless weekends working side by side with Sarah in this very kitchen, tiling the floors, measuring the counters, and perfecting the details. They had both poured so much into this home. Every inch of it was a reflection of their love and dedication. But now all he felt was the echo of those memories and the knowledge that they were slipping away. He followed Jill into the living room, where she was inspecting the fireplace, the hearth where they had spent many cold evenings curled up together. She asked a few questions about the roof, the foundation, and the age of the home, all the while jotting down notes on her pad. As Jill continued to assess the house, Charles's thoughts drifted back to the beginning. The first time he and Sarah had seen the house. The first nail they had driven into the walls. The first time they'd stepped across the threshold as owners. They had been so proud of this house, so sure that it would be the foundation of their family's future. And now it was becoming a business transaction, a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The weight of it pressed heavily on his chest, but in the quiet of the room, Charles realized something. This wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything he had built with Sarah. But he wasn't just selling memories. He was selling a future where he could finally move on, unburdened by the manipulations of those who had forgotten the value of what he had given them. Jill finished her evaluation and sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out her laptop. "Based on what I've seen so far," she said, tapping a few keys, "I would estimate that your home could sell for around $900,000, maybe a little more depending on how we market it. The location is prime, and with the work you've done on it, there's a lot of potential." Charles nodded, absorbing her words. It was more than he had expected, more than enough to secure his future. He knew that with this money, he could live comfortably, without worry, without being forced into a decision that wasn't his to make. "Thank you, Jill," Charles said, his voice steady. "I appreciate your time. I think we're ready to move forward." Jill smiled, packing up her things. "I'll get the paperwork started and keep you posted on the next steps. We'll aim to list it soon. I'm confident we'll get a great offer for this place." As she left, Charles stood in the doorway, watching her drive away. The house seemed quieter now, emptier somehow. He was ready to let go, ready to move on. But as he took one last look around, he felt a pang of loss, a small, quiet sadness for the life he had lived here, for the family he had built. But then, just as quickly, he felt something else, something stronger. Relief, hope, freedom. He wasn't just letting go of the house, he was letting go of the past. And in doing so, he was finally giving himself the chance to live for the first time in years, unburdened by the expectations of others. Charles had spent the past few days with a quiet sense of purpose. Jill had left, and he'd signed the paperwork to move forward with the sale of the house. There was a certain relief in knowing that the process had officially begun. As he went about his daily routines, sorting through old books, packing away keepsakes from his life with Sarah, and taking long walks in the neighborhood, He felt as though he was slowly shedding the weight of the past. It was a strange, bittersweet feeling, but there was no turning back now. The house would be sold. His future was starting to take shape. But there was still one thing he couldn't escape. Adam, his son. The very person who had once looked up to him, who had once trusted him and admired him, was now the one who had shown him the deepest betrayal. Charles had always tried to teach Adam the value of hard work, of family loyalty, of respect. And now, in the cold light of reality, Charles realized that none of those lessons had stuck. Adam wasn't concerned about his well-being. He wasn't even concerned about what was best for Charles. He was concerned about his own convenience, his own future. And that hurt. It hurt more than Charles had allowed himself to admit. That afternoon, as Charles was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where Sarah's chair used to be, his phone rang. It was Adam. Charles hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. He had been avoiding his son's calls, but he couldn't keep doing that. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't who he was. He had to face this, whatever it was. "Hello?" Charles answered, his voice flat but calm. "Hey, Dad, it's Adam," came the familiar voice on the other end. "How's it going?" "Same as always," Charles replied, keeping his tone neutral. He had nothing to hide, but he wasn't in the mood for the usual pleasantries. There was something in Adam's voice today, something different. It wasn't the usual forced cheerfulness, the subtle distance. This time, there was a hint of concern. "That's good to hear," Adam continued. "I've been thinking about you a lot, Dad. I know you've been going through a lot, and I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this. Megan and I have been talking, and we both agree that you should get checked out, get some care." Charles sat up straighter. His son had always been helpful, in his own way, but Charles could hear the subtle undertone in his voice now. He had become adept at recognizing the difference between genuine concern and the veiled, calculated suggestions that Adam sometimes masked as concern. "I'm fine, Adam," Charles said, keeping his voice even. "I don't need anything. Certainly not what you're offering." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Charles could practically hear Adam weighing his words. When he spoke again, his voice was more measured. "Well, Dad, Megan and I have done some research, and we think it might be a good idea for you to visit a wellness center. We found one near Denver, and it's really top-notch. You can get the medical care you need, and they have everything: staff, therapy, you name it." Charles felt a jolt of recognition in his gut, a sudden surge of clarity. He'd heard those words before. Wellness center. And the way Adam said it, it was clear that it wasn't a wellness center in the way most people would think. No, this was a euphemism, a delicate way of saying nursing home. Charles didn't need to be told. He had been around long enough to recognize the signs of manipulation. A wellness center? Really? Charles squeezed the phone, the anger that had been quietly simmering inside him rising up like a tide. The betrayal was no longer a distant suspicion. It was right there, staring him in the face. Adam wasn't offering care. He was offering a solution for Adam and Megan's comfort, a way to get Charles out of their lives, out of their plans, a way to cash in on the house and put him away, like some inconvenient piece of furniture they could no longer manage. "I'm not going to any wellness center, Adam," Charles said, his voice now cold and firm. "I'm not sick. I'm not falling apart. I'm fine." "But Dad," Adam started, but Charles cut him off, his patience running thin. "No, Adam. You've been telling me for months how I need to take care of myself, how I'm getting older, And now I see it for what it is. You and Megan want to take the house, sell it, and put me away so you can move on with your life. Well, that's not going to happen. I'm not a burden. I'm not some old man you can just shove aside when it's convenient. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Charles could hear Adam's breathing, but he didn't say anything. Charles could almost feel his son's discomfort, could hear him struggling to justify himself. Finally, Adam spoke again, but his tone was different, less calm, less controlled. It was tinged with frustration, and beneath that, something colder. You're not hearing me, Dad. You're not listening. I'm trying to help you. Megan and I have been doing the right thing by thinking ahead. You're too proud to see it, but we're trying to make sure you're taken care of. It's not about the house or the money. It's about what's best for you. Don't lie to me, Charles snapped, his voice rising now. It's never been about what's best for me. It's about what's best for you. You and Megan are just using my age as an excuse to get rid of me. I heard everything. You're just waiting for me to be old enough or weak enough to take everything from me. The words hung in the air between them, a heavy silence stretching out after Charles' outburst. Adam didn't respond right away, and when he did, it was with a sharp, defensive tone. Dad, that's not fair. You don't understand. No, you don't understand, Adam, Charles cut him off. I've spent my whole life giving, working, sacrificing for you. And now you want to take what's mine, what I built, and throw me away like I don't matter. I'm not throwing you away, Dad, Adam said quietly, but Charles could hear the frustration simmering just below the surface. I'm just trying to make sure you're not alone, that you're safe. You're my father, and I care about you. But you're being stubborn about this. No, Adam, Charles said, his voice steady and full of resolve. What you care about is getting what you think you're owed, and that's not going to happen. He could feel the finality in his words, the wall that had been built between him and Adam, now firm and solid. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though both of them knew that this was the moment everything had changed, that whatever bond had remained between them had been severed beyond repair. Finally, Adam spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to hurt you, Dad. I really didn't. But this is the best way forward for everyone. Charles' heart clenched with a mixture of sadness and fury. No, Adam. The best way forward is for me to live my life on my own terms, not yours. I'm done being your problem. The line clicked, and Charles was left in silence once more. He put the phone down slowly, feeling a cold emptiness settle over him. The betrayal that had burned in his chest the night before now felt like a slow, steady ache. But instead of being crushed by it, Charles realized something. He was no longer afraid. He had given everything for Adam. And now, it was time for him to take everything back. The sun was setting slowly, casting long golden rays across the backyard where Charles sat on the weathered wooden swing that hung from the old oak tree. The air was cooler now, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves as they danced in the evening light. The world outside the house seemed to breathe in harmony with the quiet thoughts inside Charles' mind. It had been a long, long time since he had sat here, truly sat here, without the weight of responsibility or obligation pressing down on him. In the past, he would have been waiting for Sarah to come out, calling to him from the kitchen or the living room, ready to spend a quiet evening together. Those days, it seemed, were so far removed from his reality now. He glanced down at his hands, the ones that had built this house, the ones that had held the tools that had shaped every corner, every room, every beam of wood. His hands had worked tirelessly, side by side with Sarah, to create a home filled with love, laughter, and memories. But now, as he sat alone, the house was just a structure, a building that had once held life, but no longer did. Charles hadn't realized how heavy the house had felt until he made the decision to let it go. The weight of it had been pressing down on him for months now. He had been carrying it, unwilling to part with it, believing that somehow it was the last piece of his past that held meaning. But now, as the shadows grew longer and the cool evening air enveloped him, he realized that the house wasn't the thing that had anchored him all these years. The house was no longer a home. It had been a home, but it wasn't anymore. The house, once filled with the sounds of family, laughter, arguments, celebrations, was now just an empty shell. There were no more warm dinners in the kitchen. There were no more bedtime stories read in the living room. There were no more voices calling his name, no more footsteps echoing through the halls. It was just him now, alone in a house that had become a tomb of his memories. He could still feel Sarah in every room, in every corner. The scent of her perfume lingering on the pillows, in the drawers, the marks on the doorframe where they had measured Adam's height over the years, the soft creak of the floorboards where Sarah had walked, where they had spent their years together. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. For the first time in years, he felt something that was almost like peace. The tightness in his chest began to loosen, the weight in his shoulders lifting as though something had been lifted off of him. It's time to let go. The words came to him with such clarity that it almost felt like a revelation. He had held on to the house, to the life they had built together, because it had been all he had left of Sarah. It was a way to keep her close, to keep their shared history alive. But now, as he sat there watching the sunset, he realized that the house didn't hold her any longer. It didn't keep her memory intact. It was just a place. And Sarah would always be with him, in his heart, in his memories, in the way he moved through the world. The house was only a symbol of a life that had passed. It wasn't the life itself. He had been so afraid to let go, afraid that if he let go of the house, he would be letting go of everything that mattered. But now he understood. He wasn't losing anything. He was freeing himself. The decision to sell the house, to walk away from the life he had once known, was not just about getting rid of material things. It was about releasing the hold that grief and guilt had had on him for so long. It was about moving forward, something he had refused to do for far too long. He had been holding on to this house like it was a lifeline, when in reality, it had become a chain that kept him bound to a past that no longer existed. Charles stood up from the swing and walked to the edge of the porch. The evening sky had turned a deep shade of purple, with streaks of orange and pink fading into the horizon. He looked out over the garden, the flowers Sarah had planted still in bloom, their colors a stark contrast to the fading light. The garden was alive with the hum of evening insects, the sound of life moving around him. And for the first time in a long while, Charles felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He had lived in this house for decades, clinging to the past, to the memories. But now, he was ready to move forward. He was ready to let go. His eyes wandered back to the house. The windows glowed faintly in the fading light, and for a moment, Charles thought he saw Sarah's face, a flash of her in the reflection. But when he blinked, it was gone. "It's time to go," he thought again, the words settling comfortably in his mind. He had spent years keeping everything together, sacrificing for Adam, building a future for his family. But now it was time for him to focus on himself, to live a life that was his own, not shaped by the expectations or desires of others. He had worked hard for everything he had, and now it was his turn to live, to be free. Charles turned away from the porch and walked through the house, each step bringing him closer to his decision. He moved through the rooms slowly, allowing himself to take in the sights, the sounds, the memories. But there was no sadness, no regret, only a quiet acceptance. He had done everything he could. He had given everything to his family. And now it was time to give something to himself. As he stood in the living room one last time, he took a deep breath, the familiar scent of the house filling his nostrils. The house was still the same, silent, empty. But in that silence, Charles felt something different. He felt at peace. It was time. The last box was sealed and ready to go. Charles stood in the center of the now empty living room, his hands trembling slightly as he looked around. The house that had once been full of life, laughter, and love was now just an empty shell. The walls, stripped of their photos and personal touches, seemed somehow colder. The floors, which had once creaked under the weight of footsteps, now felt silent, like they were waiting for something that would never come. He had already signed the papers. The house was sold, and the money from the sale was safely tucked away in his new account, a step towards his fresh start. But despite the relief, the freedom that had come with his decision to let go, a part of him still felt like he was leaving something behind, something important, something irreplaceable. As he moved around the house, packing the last of his belongings into boxes, his eyes kept drifting to the places that held memories. The fireplace, where they had spent countless evenings, curled up together with a cup of tea, the soft glow of the fire flickering as they talked about their day. The kitchen, where Sarah had spent hours cooking, the smells of her meals lingering in the air, and the back porch, where they had sat together, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing at all. But now all of that was gone. The rooms, once filled with so much life, were now quiet, the air thick with the weight of absence. The last room to be emptied was the bedroom. The bed, once so full of warmth and comfort, was now just a mattress on the floor, the frame already sold. Charles had already taken down the curtains and packed up the wardrobe. As he moved toward the closet, his heart skipped a beat. There, in the corner, was Sarah's jewelry box. It was small, delicate, made of polished wood, and it had always been her most prized possession. He picked it up slowly, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface. His eyes burned as he opened it, revealing the simple treasures inside. The pearl necklace she had worn on their wedding day, the silver bracelet he had given her on their 5th anniversary, the small locket with a picture of Adam inside. Each item, though small and seemingly insignificant, carried the weight of a lifetime of memories. Charles closed the jewelry box gently, his heart heavy. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding on to until this moment, how much of Sarah he had kept, not just in these objects, but in his heart, in the house, in every corner of their life together. The truth was, he had been holding on to the past, unwilling to let go. Even now, as he packed up the last of their life together, He wasn't sure if he was ready to leave it all behind. But as he stood there, staring at the jewelry box, he knew it was time. It was time to start fresh, to stop living in the shadows of memories and to build something new. He placed the box carefully into one of the moving boxes, his fingers lingering on it for a moment before he shut the lid. The new apartment was small, modest, and simple, but there was a certain peace in its simplicity. The neighborhood was quiet, with tree-lined streets and well-kept houses. It was a far cry from the bustling life of the family home, but it felt right. The apartment had no history, no weight of memories hanging over it. It was a blank slate, waiting for him to fill it with whatever he chose. Charles sat down on the small couch he had bought, staring out the window at the quiet street. It was a stark contrast to the life he had known, but in a way, it was exactly what he needed. He had lived for so long under the weight of others' expectations, his family's needs, his obligations, and now finally, he could breathe. The apartment didn't feel like home yet. It couldn't, but it would in time. He would fill it with his own life, his own memories. He would carve out a space for himself, one that was no longer defined by the people who had used him, who had tried to control his every move. The thought of Adam and Megan still lingered in the back of his mind. But now, it didn't sting like it once had. He had made his decision, and he was sticking to it. He wasn't their problem anymore. He was Charles Hayes, a man who had lived for others, who had sacrificed everything for the ones he loved. But now, it was time to live for himself. Later that night, Charles unpacked the last few boxes. He took his time, placing a few cherished items around the apartment, a photograph of Sarah, a framed picture of Adam as a child, some old books that had always been his favorites. He wasn't sure why, but as he placed Sarah's photo on the mantel of the small apartment's faux fireplace, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was as if she were still with him, guiding him through the hardest part of his life. Sitting down on the couch, Charles finally allowed himself to reflect. The house, the life, the family, those things were all part of him, but they didn't define him anymore. What he had once thought he couldn't live without was no longer what he needed. He was free. For the first time in years, Charles allowed himself a deep, cleansing breath. The weight of the past, of Adam's betrayal, of the years of sacrifice and hardship began to lift. His chest felt lighter, the air in the apartment somehow fresher, cleaner. The loneliness, once so heavy, didn't feel so suffocating anymore. The past had shaped him, yes, but it was no longer his prison. He looked around at the empty apartment, the bare walls, the new furniture, and smiled. It wasn't much, but it was his, and that, he realized, was enough. Tomorrow he would start again. He would make new memories, build a new life. And as the night stretched on, Charles allowed himself a quiet, peaceful moment, a moment where he could finally say goodbye to the past. The phone rang on the small table beside Charles's new couch, the sound jarring in the otherwise quiet apartment. He glanced at the screen and saw the name he had been dreading for days. Adam. For a brief moment, he hesitated. The memories of their last conversation still stung, but he had promised himself that he would face whatever came next. He couldn't hide forever. Charles reached for the phone, taking a slow breath before answering. "Hello?" he said, his voice steady, calm. "Dad," Adam's voice came through, colder than it had ever been. "I need to talk to you." Charles sat back in his chair, bracing himself for what was to come. "What is it, Adam?" There was a pause, a shift in the air between them. And then Adam spoke again, his words carefully chosen, measured. "I just don't get it, Dad. I really don't. You sold the house without even considering what it means for the family." Charles' eyebrows furrowed, a sense of disbelief creeping into him. The same son who had been planning to sell his house and put him away like an object now had the audacity to call him selfish? He bit back the words he wanted to say, words that would only fuel the fire, and let Adam continue. "You've made everything so much harder, you know that?" Adam's voice was growing more controlled, more detached, as if he were reading from a script he had rehearsed 1,000 times. "We're all just trying to make sure you're taken care of. You're getting older, and this wasn't the time to make decisions for yourself. You're not thinking about the bigger picture. The family needs that money. We need that money, Dad." Charles gripped the phone tighter, his fingers going cold with the anger rising inside him. Money. It always comes down to money. He had been bracing for this moment, but hearing Adam's voice, the coldness in it, the lack of any real concern for his well-being, was like a slap to the face. Adam didn't care about him. Not really. This wasn't about his health. This wasn't about family. This was about control. About what Adam thought he was entitled to. For a moment, Charles was silent. He let the words hang in the air, let Adam's accusation settle before he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You're right, Adam," Charles said, taking a deep breath. "I did sell the house, but not for the reasons you think. I sold it because I no longer want to be controlled. I sold it because I'm not your burden. I'm not your problem to solve, and I won't let you make me one." Adam's response was immediate, his voice rising with irritation. "That's exactly what I mean. You're being selfish. You don't care about what this does to the family. You're putting your own needs above the people who've been there for you. What happened to being a part of the family? Don't you think about the future?" Charles leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, but his mind was anything but. The words Adam had spoken, the accusations, the manipulation, he heard them all with a clarity that he had been too blind to notice before. This wasn't about the house. This wasn't about the family. This was about Adam's own future, about what he could get, about what he could take from Charles. "Don't try to play the family card with me, Adam," Charles replied, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You've never cared about what's best for me. This was never about what was good for your father. This was always about what you could gain, about the money, about the house, about making sure that your life was easier." Adam's silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a brief moment, Charles thought maybe he had gotten through to him. Maybe there was a sliver of truth that Adam had heard, something that would shake him. But that hope quickly dissipated when Adam spoke again, this time with a coldness that made Charles's stomach tighten. "Fine," Adam spat, his voice dripping with resentment. "I get it. You've made your choice. But don't think for a second that this is the last you'll hear from me. You've really messed things up, Dad. I'll deal with it. We'll all deal with it. But you're on your own now." The words felt like a final judgment, a cold dismissal of everything Charles had once done for his son, for his family. There was no love in Adam's voice now, no warmth, no acknowledgement of everything Charles had given to him. It was as if all those years of hard work, those years of sacrifice, had never existed. And for the first time in a long while, Charles realized that they hadn't existed for Adam, not in any meaningful way. He swallowed hard, trying to control the bitterness that welled up inside him. This is the son I raised. This is what he's become. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Adam," Charles said quietly, the finality in his voice unmistakable. "But I'm not going to apologize for making the choices that are best for me. And if you can't understand that, then maybe it's time for us to stop pretending." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. He didn't need Adam's approval or understanding anymore. Adam had made his intentions clear. He had shown his true colors. And Charles knew, deep in his bones, that he had made the right decision. He pressed the end call button slowly, the finality of it echoing in his mind. The phone dropped onto the table, and for a long moment, Charles just sat there, staring at it. He wasn't sure if he felt sad, angry, or relieved. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the weight of Adam's expectations, his manipulation, his demands. For the first time in years, he was free. And though it hurt, though it left a bitter taste in his mouth, he understood now that sometimes letting go of the ones we love the most is the only way to truly free ourselves. Charles took a deep breath, his gaze shifting back towards the window. The sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows across the street. It was a new day, a new chapter. And for the first time in a long time, Charles Hayes felt like he was finally in control of his own future. A week had passed since Charles had moved into his new apartment, and the quiet rhythm of his new life had settled in. The apartment, small but cozy, was beginning to feel more like home with each passing day. He had unpacked the last of his boxes, organized the small living room, and even put up a few personal touches: Sarah's favorite paintings, a picture of Adam as a child, a few mementos from his years working in construction. Though the apartment lacked the warmth of the family home, it was his, and for the first time in years, it felt like a place where he could breathe freely. The neighborhood was peaceful, and Charles found comfort in the simplicity of it. The days were quiet, marked by walks to the coffee shop, short trips to the market, and long evenings spent reading or watching the sunset over the horizon. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel rushed, didn't feel like he had to be anyone else but himself. But then, as the morning light began to filter through the window, there was a knock at the door. Charles was sitting at the kitchen table sipping his coffee when the sound broke his quiet moment. He hesitated for a moment, wondering who it could be. It had been a while since anyone had come to visit, aside from the occasional neighbor who greeted him with a friendly nod. He hadn't expected company, and yet there it was, a soft but persistent knock on the door. He set his coffee cup down and stood, walking slowly toward the door. When he opened it, he was met with the last person he expected to see: Megan, Adam's wife. Her smile was wide, a practiced kindness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Megan was dressed in a sharp, elegant outfit, the kind of clothing she wore to impress, to control the room. She stood there, looking at him with a calculated warmth, as if they were long-lost friends who had reconnected after years of separation. Charles," Megan said, her voice sweet, almost syrupy. "I've been meaning to check in on you. I heard from Adam that you were settling in well. I wanted to come by and make sure you're doing okay." Charles raised an eyebrow. Settling in well? Adam had probably told her nothing of the kind. If he had, he certainly hadn't mentioned his angry outburst the last time they'd spoken. But Charles wasn't about to challenge her pretense just yet. He invited her in with a gesture and a smile that was just as calm, just as measured as hers. "Please come in, Megan," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. Megan walked in, glancing around the modest apartment with a cool, calculated eye. She didn't comment on the simple furniture or the lack of decoration. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, making sure her smile was still in place as she turned back to Charles. "This place looks nice," she said, though her tone seemed more polite than sincere. "I'm sure it's a big adjustment, but I'm glad to see you're getting settled." Charles nodded, his hands resting casually on his hips. "It's been a change, that's for sure. But I'm managing." Megan took a step closer, her voice lowering a little, becoming more intimate, as though she was letting him in on a secret. "You know, Adam's been really worried about you. He's been talking about how much he cares, about wanting to make sure you're taken care of. He just wants what's best for you, Charles. He really does." Charles couldn't help but smile slightly at the irony. She was good at this, good at playing the part of the concerned wife. But Charles saw through the act. He could read between the lines. He knew exactly what she was doing. "Oh, I'm sure he's concerned," Charles replied, his voice neutral, unbothered. "Adam's always had a way of wanting to control things, hasn't he?" Megan's smile faltered for a brief second, but it was quickly replaced by another polite chuckle. "Oh, Charles, you're just so funny," she said, waving a hand as if to dismiss his comment. "He's only trying to help. We all are." Charles's smile remained, but it was a little colder now, more knowing. "So what is it you're really here for, Megan?" he asked gently, his eyes meeting hers. Megan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't expected him to cut through the pleasantries so quickly. But she recovered quickly, her smile returning as she pulled a small envelope from her purse and held it out to him. "Well," she began, her voice suddenly more serious, "Adam and I were talking, and we've decided that maybe you'd like to get away for a little while. You've been through a lot recently, and we thought it might help to take some time for yourself. We've arranged a little trip, nothing too extravagant, just a family vacation to a luxury resort. It'll be the perfect place for you to relax and enjoy yourself while still being close to us, to family. Adam has already taken care of the details." Charles took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the paper, and looked at it for a moment. Inside, he imagined, would be all the details. Dates, arrangements, probably even travel plans. But what Megan didn't realize was that he wasn't even remotely interested in what was in that envelope. "Is that so?" Charles said softly, raising an eyebrow as he let the envelope rest on the table. "A luxury resort, huh? And here, I thought you were more concerned about my well-being, not my comfort." Megan's eyes flickered with a brief flash of irritation, but she quickly masked it with another smile. "Of course, Charles. It's just about making sure you're taken care of. We just want to make sure you have everything you need, and we think this could be a wonderful opportunity for you." Charles leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping the side of the envelope. He could feel the weight of it, the weight of the offer, the weight of the manipulation. He knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a family vacation. It was another way for Adam and Megan to get him out of the way, to put him somewhere they could manage him, somewhere he wouldn't have control over his own life. But instead of reacting with anger, Charles smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He had been prepared for this moment. Megan and Adam had underestimated him, thinking that their usual tactics would work on him. But he had learned over the past few weeks. He had learned to see through the pretense, to understand the motives behind every word, every action. "Thank you for the offer, Megan," he said, his voice calm, his smile still in place. "But I think I'm good for now. I've already made my own plans, and they don't include a resort or a trip away from my new home. I'm doing just fine on my own." Megan's smile faltered once again, but she recovered quickly, though this time it was a little more strained. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to reject her offer so easily. "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to reach us," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "I'll keep that in mind," Charles replied, with a soft, polite nod. Megan hesitated for a moment, looking around the apartment as if trying to assess whether she had missed something, but there was nothing left to say. She knew she had lost. "Well, I guess I'll leave you to it then," she said, her tone a little cooler now. "I hope you'll reconsider, Charles. We're just trying to make sure you're okay." "Thanks, Megan," he said, his voice still steady. "But I think I'm more than okay now. I'm better than I've been in a long time." As she turned to leave, Charles stood by the door, watching her go. When the door clicked shut behind her, he allowed himself a small smile. He had seen through the ruse, and now it was time for Megan and Adam to see that they had underestimated him. He wasn't their pawn, and he wasn't going to be manipulated any longer. He was in control of his life, and that felt like the most powerful thing of all. The morning was crisp and quiet, with the early sun barely warming the streets. Charles stood in front of the house one last time, his gaze sweeping over the familiar front yard, the same yard where Adam had once played ball as a child, where he and Sarah had spent countless hours gardening, and where the family dog had run freely for years. The house seemed to stand still, as if frozen in time, its walls holding on to every memory, every conversation, every laughter and tear that had ever filled its rooms. But now, those memories were all that remained. Today would be the last day he set foot in this house, the house he had built with his own hands, the house that had once held his family together. Charles had made the decision to sell it, to move on from everything it represented. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to take one last final step to make sure his departure was complete. There would be no remnants of his life left for Adam and Megan to claim. No final piece for them to use as leverage. No more control. He had already signed the papers, the sale was final, and the new owners were due to take possession in just a few days. But Charles couldn't walk away without taking one last action, one last gesture to show that his life was no longer in their hands. It was time to close the door on this chapter completely. Charles had arranged for a locksmith to meet him at the house at dawn. The man, a burly figure in his 40s, had arrived early, his van parked across the street. He'd been discreet, having understood the need for secrecy. The last thing Charles wanted was for Adam and Megan to find out what he was doing until it was too late. He had no intentions of informing them. The sale had been final, the transaction complete, and now the house belonged to someone else. He wasn't about to give Adam the satisfaction of knowing what he had planned. Charles unlocked the front door, letting himself in for what would be the final time. The house was eerily quiet, the rooms stripped of all their personal touches. The photos that once lined the walls, the furniture that had made it feel like home, were all gone. The air felt empty, the silence oppressive. But there was a strange peace in it. This was the last step. He was closing the door, locking it, and walking away without a trace. The locksmith followed Charles inside, a quiet professional, doing his job with efficient precision. They moved swiftly, replacing each lock on the front door, the back door, and the garage. Charles observed in silence, his mind elsewhere, focusing on the task at hand. As the locksmith finished his work, Charles paid him in cash, grateful for the man's discretion. There were no questions asked, no need for explanations. The locksmith's job was done, and so was Charles's. He had taken care of everything. Adam and Megan wouldn't be able to get in. They wouldn't have any keys to this house. When they returned, it would be gone, and they would have no power over it. The house was no longer their domain. Charles walked through the rooms slowly, taking in the details one last time. The kitchen, where Sarah had prepared countless meals. The living room, where they had gathered as a family to watch movies, to talk, to laugh. The bedrooms, where Adam had slept as a child, where he had grown into the man who had now betrayed him. He paused in the living room, staring at the fireplace, the place where they had spent so many quiet evenings together. The memories flooded back, Sarah's laughter, the soft hum of the TV, the comfort of being together as a family. Those moments, those simple joys, would always stay with him. No one could take those from him. But now, it was time to let go. It was time to leave this behind, to take his life back into his own hands. Charles walked to the front door, where the locksmith had just finished his work. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the street, his fingers grazing the doorframe one last time. He had loved this house, but now he was ready to move on. Before leaving, Charles reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside, he had written a short note. He didn't want to leave this house without leaving one last message. It wasn't for the new owners. They would find it later after everything was settled. The note was for Adam and Megan. Charles carefully taped the envelope to the front door, placing it in clear view. Then he turned and walked away, his steps measured, steady. He wasn't looking back anymore. The note read, "Adam and Megan, you've spent so much time thinking about what you can take, about what you're owed. But let me make one thing clear. I don't owe you anything. This house, my life, my decisions, they are mine to make, not yours to control. I gave you everything, and in return, you tried to take everything from me. I am not a burden, and I will not be your pawn. This is my final decision, and I am leaving this house behind to start my own life. I don't need your approval, your offers, or your manipulation. You were my family once, but now you are just a memory. I hope you understand that I've finally found my freedom. Goodbye, Charles." Charles didn't look back as he walked down the street, his footsteps quiet but resolute. He could feel the weight lifting with every step, the burden of years of manipulation, guilt, and control slowly slipping away. The house was gone. The past was gone. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. It was early afternoon when Charles' phone rang. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his new apartment, sipping on a cup of coffee, the warm liquid providing the familiar comfort he had come to appreciate. It had been a few days since he had sealed the door on his past, and yet the weight of it still lingered in his chest. He knew this day would come. He had been waiting for it, but nothing could have prepared him for how it would feel when it finally arrived. The phone buzzed again, and this time, the name on the screen made his stomach tighten. It was Adam. Charles stared at the screen for a moment, the coldness of the name burning in his mind. He could almost hear the frantic urgency in Adam's voice before even answering. He didn't want to pick it up, didn't want to give his son the satisfaction of hearing his voice. But he knew he had to face this moment. He exhaled deeply, and with a calmness that surprised even him, He pressed the green button and brought the phone to his ear. "Hello?" Charles said, his voice steady. "Dad!" Adam's voice came through loud and panicked, unmistakable frustration seeping through the words. "What the hell is going on? Why are the locks changed? Why can't we get into the house? We need to talk about this." Charles allowed himself a small smile, the sense of satisfaction welling up inside him. He had known this would be how it played out, how Adam and Megan would scramble when they realized that they no longer held the reins. This was the reckoning, the moment Adam would finally understand that he was no longer in control. "Change the locks," Charles said slowly, his voice unbothered, almost casual. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Adam. The house is sold. The transaction is complete. The new owners should be taking possession soon. I just made sure everything was in order before they moved in." "What do you mean, sold?" Adam's voice cracked with disbelief. "You can't just sell the house without telling us. You can't just—" Charles leaned back in his chair, setting his cup down on the table. His fingers traced the edge of the saucer, the rhythm soothing as he listened to Adam's panic. This was what Charles had been waiting for, the sound of his son scrambling, realizing that he had no power, no claim to the things he once thought he controlled. "No, Adam, you're mistaken," Charles interrupted, his voice low and calm. "The house is no longer mine to give. I sold it, and it's no longer part of this family. I made the decision, and now it's over. You have no claim over it, and you have no claim over me anymore. You and Megan were never entitled to anything from me." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a brief moment, Charles thought Adam might have hung up. But then the words came rushing out, angry and desperate. "This is ridiculous, Dad. You can't just cut us out like this. You can't make decisions without consulting us. We're family. You're being selfish. You don't even understand what you've done." Charles let Adam's words hang in the air for a moment before responding, his voice unwavering. "Selfish?" he repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "You're the one who's been selfish, Adam. You've never cared about what's best for me, only about what you could get from me. I've spent my entire life working for you, for this family, and this is how you repay me? By thinking you're entitled to my life, my house, my decisions?" Adam was silent again, but this time the silence stretched on. Charles could almost hear his son's mind racing, the realization settling in like a cold, hard truth. "Where's Megan?" Charles asked, his voice calm as ever. She's on the phone with the new owners," Adam said quickly, his frustration and panic evident. "We're trying to work this out. They'll listen to us. We'll figure this out. But you, Dad, you need to stop being stubborn. You don't understand how important this is. You've taken everything from us." Charles couldn't help but let out a small, dry chuckle at the absurdity of Adam's words. Taken everything from you? Was this how he really saw things? Was this what he thought was happening? "Adam," Charles said, his tone softening slightly, "I didn't take anything from you. I gave everything. And you know what? It's time you start understanding that. You've been so focused on what you think you're owed that you've completely forgotten about the sacrifices I made for you, for this family. You never once stopped to ask what I wanted. But now, I'm telling you, I'm not your problem anymore." He heard Adam's breathing grow heavier, the panic creeping back into his voice. "Dad, you can't just do this. You can't just walk away and leave us with nothing. What about the family? What about—" Charles cut him off, his patience now fully spent. "The family?" You've shown me exactly what family means to you, Adam. It's about control. It's about money. It's about what you can get. But you don't get to take anything from me anymore. Not the house, not the money, not my life. It's time for me to live for myself, and I don't need your permission to do that. There was another long pause, and for a moment, Charles wondered if Adam was going to speak again. But the silence stretched on, and when Adam finally spoke, his voice was small, almost defeated. "Why, Dad?" he asked quietly. "Why are you doing this?" Charles let out a long, steady breath. He had no more fight left in him for this conversation. There was nothing left to explain. "Because I've spent too many years putting everyone else's needs before mine," he said softly. "Because I've spent my whole life sacrificing for people who didn't appreciate it. And now, it's my turn. It's my turn to make my own choices, to live for myself." For the first time in this entire conversation, Charles felt something stir inside him, something powerful, something that had been dormant for so long. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He was at peace. This was the end of something, but it was also the beginning of something else. A new chapter, one that would be entirely his own. "I hope you'll understand one day, Adam," Charles said quietly. "But I'm not waiting around for you to decide what's best for me. The house is sold. The locks are changed. And I'm gone." There was no response from Adam. Just the sound of his shallow breathing, as if he were trying to process the weight of what Charles had just said. The silence stretched out for what seemed like an eternity, and finally, Charles ended the call. He stared at the phone for a long moment, feeling the tension leave his shoulders, the knots in his chest unraveling slowly. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom, complete freedom. Adam's manipulation, his demands, his sense of entitlement were gone. And Charles, for the first time in a long time, was free to live for himself. He set the phone down and stood up, looking out the window at the quiet street below. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. But this time, those shadows didn't feel oppressive. They felt peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, Charles knew he had made the right choice. The apartment was quiet. The only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of a leaf outside the window, moved by the breeze. The sun was beginning to set again, casting a golden light across the small space that Charles had come to consider his own. He had finished his evening routine, eating a simple dinner, washing the dishes, taking a moment to look through some old photo albums Sarah had kept. And now he sat in his new chair, hands folded on his lap, staring into the distance. It had been a long day, a difficult one. The call with Adam still echoed in his mind, and the weight of his son's words had settled heavily in his chest. Charles had expected it, of course, the anger, the disbelief, the frustration. He knew Adam would resist. He had always resisted change, always clung to the familiar, even when it was toxic. But what had hurt the most, what truly unsettled Charles, was the realization that Adam didn't understand. He didn't understand the sacrifices Charles had made for him, for their family. He didn't understand the depth of the love that had driven every decision, every action Charles had ever taken. A deep disappointment settled over him, heavier than any burden he had ever carried. Charles had given everything for Adam, every ounce of his strength, every hour of his labor, every drop of his energy. And yet, Adam couldn't see it. He couldn't see the late nights Charles had worked, the years spent scraping by, just so Adam could have a better life. He couldn't see the countless sacrifices, the moments Charles had put his own needs aside, all to ensure his family was taken care of. Charles had always believed that his love for Adam would be enough. He had believed that his sacrifices, his hard work, would show Adam what truly mattered in life. But in the end, Adam had only seen the dollar signs, the house, the things Charles had worked so hard to provide. He had never seen his father's heart. He had never understood the quiet hours spent worrying about the future, the moments of doubt when Charles wondered if he was doing enough. And now that disappointment felt like a weight pressing down on him. He had spent so many years trying to do the right thing for Adam, trying to be the kind of father who always put his family first. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Adam had never fully understood him, never fully appreciated what he had done. And that truth stung, deeper than any insult or accusation could ever reach. But even as he sat there, feeling the weight of that disappointment, something else began to rise within him. It was subtle at first, a quiet flicker of something deep inside. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Freedom. The decision to move, to sell the house, to cut ties with Adam. It had been a long time coming. Charles had always carried the weight of his family's needs, the burden of trying to do right by them. But now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't someone's father, someone's provider, someone's caretaker. He was just Charles. He was his own man again. And as he sat in his chair staring out the window, Charles realized something that had eluded him for years. He had done everything he could. He had loved his son. He had given his all. He had taught Adam everything he knew about hard work, about sacrifice, about what it meant to love someone with all your heart. He had been a father in every sense of the word. But there came a time when even love couldn't force someone to understand. He had tried for so long to teach Adam the value of love and family. But now, Charles saw that Adam's path was his own to choose, just as Charles' path was his. And while the disappointment still lingered, it was no longer the thing that defined him. Charles stood up slowly, walking over to the small window that overlooked the quiet street. The world outside was still, calm, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an overwhelming storm. It felt like a new beginning. He had always believed that the love of a father would be enough to shape his son, to guide him. But now he knew that love alone couldn't carry the weight of the world. Adam had to learn his own lessons, make his own choices, and face the consequences of his actions. And Charles couldn't carry that burden anymore. A deep breath filled his lungs, and Charles felt the weight lift, little by little. He wasn't a burden anymore. He wasn't someone's problem. He was free to make his own choices, to live on his own terms. And in that moment, he understood the one thing he had failed to grasp all these years. His love for Adam was not meant to be an anchor for him. It was meant to be a gift that Adam could choose to accept or reject as he saw fit. But Charles had done his part. He had loved unconditionally, and now it was time to let go. The phone on the table buzzed again, pulling Charles from his thoughts. It was a text message from an unknown number. He didn't recognize the name, but his heart sank as he read the message. "Dad, can we talk? I'm sorry. I want to make things right." Charles stared at the screen for a long moment. The message was a simple one, an apology, perhaps even an olive branch. Adam had reached out, perhaps realizing too late what he had lost. But Charles didn't feel the rush of emotion he thought he might. There was no guilt, no longing to fix things. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance. He put the phone down without replying, his decision clear. He had already made his peace. Adam would have to find his own way. And as much as it hurt, Charles understood now that sometimes the hardest thing a father could do was let go. He had loved, he had given, and now he was letting go of the responsibility to fix what was broken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles sat back in his chair, his heart finally at ease. The apartment was quiet again, and the shadows of the evening stretched across the room. But this time, Charles didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. He felt lighter. He was free. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all. It was late afternoon when the knock came. Charles had been sitting by the window, sipping his coffee, watching the familiar faces of his new neighborhood pass by. People who had no expectations of him, no judgments, no hidden agendas. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with the silence, with the stillness of his life. He wasn't the man he used to be, the man who'd been weighed down by obligations and guilt. That man had left with the house. The man who stood now was someone new, someone who understood that true freedom came not from having everything, but from walking away from the things that shackled you. The knock echoed through the quiet apartment, sharp and unexpected. Charles stood slowly, his old bones creaking as he made his way to the door. He already knew who it was. He wasn't surprised, not anymore. When he opened the door, Adam and Megan stood there, as expected. Adam with his posture straight, his face a mixture of frustration and desperation. And Megan beside him, her expression controlled, but with an undercurrent of something darker, guilt, perhaps, or maybe anger. They had come to confront him, to demand answers, to reclaim what they thought was rightfully theirs. Charles knew this day would come. They had never been willing to let him go, never been willing to accept that he was no longer the man they could control. "Dad," Adam said, his voice strained but assertive. "We need to talk." Charles stepped aside, his gaze steady as he allowed them to enter. He could see the tension in their bodies, the way they tried to project authority as though they still thought they had some power over him. "Go ahead," Charles said, his voice calm, almost inviting. "Talk." Adam didn't waste time. "What's going on, Dad? You sold the house. You changed the locks. You've completely shut us out. You've taken everything from us. How could you do this to your own family? We were just trying to help you, to make sure you weren't alone. And this is how you repay us?" Charles didn't flinch. His eyes remained calm as Adam's words tumbled out, as if trying to find some way to manipulate him, to make him feel guilty. But Charles was beyond that now. He had lived his life for them, for his wife, for his son, for everyone else who needed him. But no longer. No more. "You didn't want to help me, Adam," Charles said, his voice low but unwavering. "You wanted control. You wanted to push me out of my own life so you could have what you thought was owed to you. You didn't care about me. You cared about the house, the money, what you could gain from my age, from my vulnerability. I was never your responsibility, Adam. I was never your burden, and I won't be your pawn anymore." Megan stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't understand, Charles. We didn't want to do this. We were just looking out for you. Adam was worried about you. He wanted what was best for you. You've taken everything from us, our future, our peace of mind. You think we didn't try to make this work? Charles looked at Megan, his gaze cold but unwavering. You didn't try to make anything work. You only tried to control me. You tried to put me away like I didn't matter, like I wasn't even a person anymore. You thought I was just a means to an end. Well, I'm done. I'm done being the meek, generous father you've always relied on to clean up your messes. I'm done with being the one who gives and gives and gives until there's nothing left. I'm done being your family when it's convenient for you. Adam's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know what you're talking about, Dad. You think you're the only one who's had it hard? You think you're the only one who's sacrificed? You don't know what this is doing to us. Charles felt a flicker of something inside him. Rage, maybe, or perhaps something darker, but he controlled it, letting it pass. He had learned to let go of that kind of emotion. It didn't serve him anymore, not with Adam, not with Megan. You're right, Charles said softly, his eyes meeting Adam's with an intensity that made his son pause. I don't know what you've been through, but I know what I've been through. And I've given enough. I've given you everything, Adam. I've given you a life. I've given you my time, my energy, my sacrifices. But it was never enough, was it? It was never enough for you. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Charles' words hanging heavily between them. Megan looked away first, unable to meet his eyes. Adam stood frozen, his face twisted in something between anger and confusion. Charles stepped closer, his voice quieter now, but firm. I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need your forgiveness. I don't need anything from you. What I need, Adam, is to live the rest of my life for myself, to make my own choices, to walk away from all of this. And that's exactly what I'm doing. Adam opened his mouth, ready to say something, probably to try to manipulate him further, to guilt him into caring. But Charles raised a hand, cutting him off. You've had your chance, Adam. You've had my love, my time, my life, and you chose to take what you could. But this time, it's my turn. I'm done playing the role you want me to play. I'm done being your old, helpless father for you to control. There was a finality in Charles's voice now, one that didn't leave room for argument, for persuasion. He had made his decision. He had walked away from everything, from the guilt, from the expectations, from the roles they had tried to force upon him. He was no longer the man they could manipulate. He was his own man. I'm not the one who took everything from you, Adam, Charles said quietly, his voice steady. I gave, and now I'm taking back what's mine. He turned away from them, walking toward the door with a quiet confidence that neither of them could touch. He didn't need to say another word. He didn't need to explain himself any further. This was the end of the line, and he had walked away from the past, from their demands, from the life they tried to impose on him. As Charles opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, he felt something stir inside him. Something powerful, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. For the first time in years, he was free, and he knew, deep in his heart, that this was the moment Adam and Megan would never forget. The morning sun peeked through the blinds of Charles' modest apartment, casting soft light across the room. The air was crisp and fresh, the promise of a new day unfolding before him. He had no obligations today, no expectations to meet, no one waiting for him to act or be someone he wasn't. For the first time in years, he had woken up not to a calendar full of appointments, not to the weight of someone else's needs, but to a quiet, peaceful silence that was entirely his own. The soft chime of his phone broke the stillness, but Charles didn't hurry to check it. Instead, He stretched slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He wasn't bound by urgency anymore. He wasn't rushing to answer calls, to please anyone, or to meet anyone's expectations. He was just living. His morning routine was simple, but he had come to love it. He made his coffee, slowly savoring each step. He didn't have to rush through it, didn't have to prepare breakfast for anyone else, or wait for someone to tell him what to do next. He simply enjoyed the process, the smell of the beans grinding, the steam rising from the mug, the quiet hum of the world waking up around him. After his coffee, he pulled on his jacket and made his way to the local coffee shop. It wasn't much, just a small cozy place a few blocks from his apartment, but it had become his daily retreat. The barista knew his order by heart now, a black coffee with just a splash of cream. Charles didn't mind the small talk, the way the other patrons greeted him with friendly nods. Here, he was just another face, just another man in the neighborhood, and that felt good. He wasn't Charles, the father, or Charles, the provider. He was simply Charles. The barista, a young woman with an easy smile, handed him his coffee one morning as usual, and they exchanged a few pleasantries. She asked how his morning was going, and he told her it was quiet, peaceful. She asked if he was planning on taking his usual walk, and he nodded, telling her he was thinking of trying a new route today, seeing more of the neighborhood. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the simple joy of a conversation between two people who barely knew each other but shared a small moment of connection. Charles found himself appreciating these small interactions more and more. He wasn't defined by what he could provide for anyone else anymore. The world around him was full of people, strangers, acquaintances, neighbors, and for the first time, he felt like he could be part of it on his own terms. No one was asking for anything from him. They weren't looking for something to take. They were simply there, living their own lives, as he was now living his. After the coffee, Charles took a long walk through the tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, the cool morning air filling his lungs as he moved at his own pace. There was no need to rush. He walked slowly, savoring the quiet of the streets. It was still early enough that most of the neighborhood was asleep, and Charles had the world to himself. He passed by homes with manicured lawns, the scent of fresh-cut grass in the air, and he felt the weight of the past, of his former life, begin to fade even more. He wasn't looking at these houses with envy, wondering if he had made the right choices. He wasn't comparing himself to anyone else. He was simply walking, enjoying the simple act of moving through the world without a care. He stopped by a small park where a few elderly men were playing chess, their conversation light and easy, the chess pieces clicking against the board as they made their moves. Charles took a seat on a nearby bench, watching them for a while. They didn't know him, but they didn't need to. He wasn't looking for recognition anymore. He was just content to be. As the day wore on, Charles walked to the library, where he picked out a few books he'd been meaning to read. He had the time now, and there was no rush. He had learned in the past few months that the pursuit of knowledge and self-growth didn't need to be urgent. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. That evening, as he sat in his small, cozy apartment, the light of the setting sun casting a warm glow across the room, Charles reflected on how far he had come. He had let go of so much, the weight of family obligations, the expectations placed on him, the guilt that had held him captive for years. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. There were still moments when the past would creep into his thoughts, when the disappointment in Adam's eyes would linger in his mind. But those moments were fewer now. He had learned that freedom wasn't about being unencumbered by the past, but about not letting it define you. He had let go of his need to fix everything, to make everyone happy. He had embraced the idea that he was worthy of living his life for himself, and in that he had found peace. The phone buzzed again, and Charles glanced at the screen. It was a message from one of the neighbors he had met in passing, an invitation to a small gathering this weekend. He smiled, knowing that he had started to build his own place in the world, his own space where he was valued for who he was, not for what he could give. As Charles stood by the window that evening, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of completion settle over him. The life he had once lived, filled with sacrifice, guilt, and the constant struggle to please others, was no more. He had walked away from it all, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. He had chosen himself. In the distance, the city skyline stretched out before him, a silhouette against the fading light. Charles knew that the future was full of possibilities, of new experiences and new connections. The world was wide open, and for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it fully. He took a deep breath, inhaling the cool evening air, and looked ahead, no longer haunted by the past, no longer bound by the chains of expectation. He was free, and for the first time in his life, he was living on his own terms.